Hello and welcome to Sew High Pile with Style. I am Dawn from Creative Appliques. In this class, we will explore how to sew beautiful designs onto challenging fabrics like terry cloth, sherpa, and fuzzy fabrics. We will cover the proper stabilizers to use, explore what are the best types of designs to use, and how to get great looking results. So let's get started. So what fabrics are we talking about here? Well, with cooler temperatures comes sherpa weather. And we all love to see our monograms on those. But this fabric is so thick, the initials can get buried in the fluff. Then with Christmas, everyone needs a personalized stocking. But the cuff is often furry and thick too. And how about if you know someone getting married or going off to college, then personalized towels are a great gift idea. But how do you sew onto these furry, fuzzy, fluffy fabrics? Well, let's get started and explore. So what we were talking about is any fabric with loft, nap, or pile. I have included a downloadable PDF that goes into more details about these fabrics, so make sure to go download that from the virtual booth. There are several things we could do to make the design stand out and show up. Okay, for starters, we want to make sure we have the proper stabilization. For towels or anything that's terry cloth, for stockings, since these things the fabric doesn't stretch on these, you could get away with using a tearaway stabilizer. The rule of thumb is if the fabric is stretchy, has any kind of stretch at all, you're going to want to use a cutaway stabilizer. So with the terry cloth, with the stockings, they don't stretch, so you can use a tearaway on them. If you are using sherpa does stretch. So you're going to want to use a cutaway stabilizer. Also with the minky and the fleece, they do stretch as well. So you want to use a cutaway stabilizer with those. So as long as the item you're sewing is not stretchy, you can use a tearaway. If it is stretchy, then you always use a cutaway. Now another option to use is sticky stabilizer. I really don't like using sticky stabilizer because it gets stuck to the back of the item and can be really hard to pull off. So rather I prefer to use a stabilizer with some temporary spray adhesive on it. With these items, it's really challenging to hoop them, and so we are going to do what's called floating. The reason why we don't want to hoop these is because they're really thick. Also, another reason is when you hoop it, you could get what's called hoop burn on the fabric that sometimes may not come off. So what we do instead is called floating. So I will walk you through and show you how to do that right now. So we will take our hoop and we will hoop just the stabilizer. So again, if this is a cutaway or a tearaway, it's going to depend on the item you're sewing onto. So we're going to hoop the stabilizer. Then we take some temporary spray adhesive. Now this is specific for machine embroidery, and you're going to want to make sure you get the specific type of spray adhesive to use. You want it to be temporary, not permanent. You want to make sure it's specific for machine embroidery, since if you are using something that is not for an embroidery machine, it could gunk up your needle. It could cause problems with your machine. So this one here says machine embroidery, and it's a temporary spray adhesive. So I'm just going to give it a good shot in there. And this is to kind of simulate a sticky stabilizer, but it's not as intense with the way it sticks. So now we're going to take our item and we're going to place it on top and flatten it down. And then we are going to pin it through the stabilizer. On all four sides. Now, if this is a larger item and I had more area, I would probably pin it even more. And now that it's all secured, you are ready to sew. If you are on a single needle machine and you have the ability to put a basting stitch around it, I would encourage you to sew the basting stitch around it first as well, to make sure that the fabric is really flattened down onto the stabilizer and secure before you start to sew. Now let's talk about the type of designs we can sew onto these items. Of course, you can do any kind of embroidery or applique or monogram or lettering. If you're doing an applique design, the fabric used within the applique design is going to stand out. And so the thing that I would do is, after I've finished sewing down all of the pieces of fabric, I would then take a water-soluble stabilizer and lay it on top of that and pin it out of the way, and then sew the rest of the decorative stitching on top of that. The water-soluble stabilizer is going to give a nice, it's going to flatten down the pile. And so once the pile is flattened down, the stitches will be able to stand out better. So the water-soluble stabilizer I like to use is not the super thick Solvay. It's the thinner stuff that, it washes away in water, or it tears away very easily as well. So this you would lay on top of the applique design after the fabric is all stitched, and then lay it down, pin it in place, and then you can sew the rest of the decorative stitching. So now we're going to talk about sewing monograms or fonts onto these types of fabrics. So it's very important to choose the correct fonts. So here you can see I have taken a floss stitch font and I have sewn it onto this towel. Now, a floss stitch font is a running stitch or a bean stitch. This stitching here is actually 5 times, for each stitch you see here, it's 5 times sewn. So it goes 5 times back and forth in the same spot and then goes on to the next spot. And as you can see, it's not standing out very well because of the terry cloth is, in the way. It's covering the stitching. So that's not standing out very well. So a bean or a floss stitch font is not a great idea for anything that has pile or loft. This is a terry cloth, which is not even as dense as the fur on the stocking. So here, this is a satin stitch font, but it is a thinner satin stitch font. So with this, you can see how the fur is kind of covering some parts of the letters. This is a very popular font right now because it's a farmhouse font, and everything farmhouse is so popular. And so you look at that and go, that is really, really thin. I can't see it very well, and it gets covered by the fur. So that's another consideration. Even though it's a satin stitch font, a thin satin stitch isn't going to show up very well either. On the Sherpa here, we have our Empire Circle font, and we sewed it directly onto the Sherpa. And you can see that we can't even really read those letters very well at all. So with the towel, which has, less of a loft or a nap than the Sherpa or the fur, we sewed a single letter here, and all we used was water-soluble stabilizer. Now you can see this font is a much wider satin stitch than this one, than the farmhouse one. So you can see by simply using a thicker, wider satin stitch font, you get a much better show out of the letter. And I know it's not on the, this letter is not on the fur, but this letter, with it being so much thicker and wider with the satin stitching, would show up so much better. So for the towel, all I did was used a water-soluble stabilizer and sewed the font on the towel that way. So we did the comparison of the thick font with the thin font on and being able to see it better. So now, what if we take a thick font and we sew it onto something like the cuff with the fur for the stocking? So you can see the thicker font on the right here does show up better. You can see it a lot better, but it still has some of this, it still kind of gets a bit lost in there, okay? And it still doesn't look so finished. So how are we going to get it to stand out even better? So there is something that we can do that's going to get the font to stand out much, much better. We have here what's called a nap pile down shape, and it is sewn first, and then the font is sewn on top of it. So what this does is it flattens down all of the loft here, and it allows your name to stand out. So let's look at that on the Sherpa. So remember we showed you this font here, and we didn't use any water-soluble stabilizer. We didn't use any of the nap down frame. So it's not standing out very well. The letters are really, really buried in there. Now let's look at the difference when we do use the nap down frame. Look at how that stands out. So what I did here is I used the brown thread to match the Sherpa and then sewed the letters on top of it. Same thing with the stocking. I used white thread to sew down the loft and then sewed the letters on top of that. So let me give you a little, some hints on how to get the best coverage using these frames. So here's an example I sewed. And when I did, I sewed it in white so it shows up better and you can see the coverage of it. So for this one, I just put the fabric on the hoop like this and I just pressed go. Okay? It still gives great coverage. It's still flattened out a lot of the loft. Okay? So you can see it's flattened out a nice circle there, and then we could sew the monogram on top of it and it would probably be completely fine. But one thing I wanted to talk about was how to take the Sherpa or thick items and really get the best coverage from the frames, and then you would sew your monogram on top of that. So one thing you want to check is which direction does it seem like the pile lays down the best? And it's something you're going to have to look at when you put your Sherpa on your frame. But as you can see here, this way, it looks like it's really flattening down nicely. If I go in this direction, it's not flattening down so well. So you're going to have to just kind of play with it and see which direction seems like it flattens down the best. And why I'm suggesting this is because when you flatten down the Sherpa, it helps the stitches lay the Sherpa down even better. Now with my frames, the way they are digitized is they are sewn on an angle like this, at about a 45-degree angle. And so because of that, you want to get the Sherpa laid down very nicely so that when the frame stitches, it's going to really flatten out the Sherpa very nicely. Now to give you a little better visual on this, for this piece of Sherpa here, I flattened out the loft in this direction. And when I did it in this direction, the stitches sewed this way. So it's sewed parallel to the way I flattened out the Sherpa. So you can kind of see there's a little bit of the Sherpa still poking up. Now it's not awful and it will be fine. It will probably look beautiful still with a font sewed over that. But just for comparison, I wanted to show you this one that I sewed after I flattened the Sherpa down in this direction. So I flattened the Sherpa down in this direction, and then the stitches, the frame sewed this way, from top right to bottom left. So that's something to consider when you are sewing the Sherpa, is if you flatten it down first, you can get a much better coverage that doesn't have as much of the loft poking out. So I brought the Nap Loft Down Circle 3" into the software. And one thing I want to really caution you about is not to resize the designs. Because when you make the designs smaller or larger, depending on your machine or your software, it might take the shape and the stitching and remove some of the stitches. So I highly caution you, if you do end up resizing these shapes, they can leave gaps in the stitching. So if at all possible, if you do need to resize it, please do a test stitch on something, on a scrap. So now that we've brought in the shape, then you will load your font, whatever font or letter, monogram, word you are using, and bring it in and to the software. So right now I'm looking for the Empire. I have a lot of fonts. Okay, let's try the 2.5 and see how it looks. It's looking a little big, so let's try the 2-inch. So the 2-inch might actually work best. And you can move them around. Okay, and then center it. So what you would do is you would sew the circle first, and then I like to sew the circle in the same color as the item I'm sewing on. So when you saw the brown circle, I sewed the circle or the frame in the same color thread as the brown, and then the letters in whatever color you would like it to be. And that the letters would go second. So you would sew the circle first and then sew the circles second. Oh, sorry, sew the letters second on top. So I'm using Embrilliant software here, and all I would do is, now that these two designs are here, I would save the file and then load it to my machine to stitch it. So we have a set of all these shapes. It's a set with 10 different shapes. There is a circle, a rounded square, a square, an oval, a diamond, a rounded oval, a rectangle, and a scallop. So you will receive all 10 of those shapes in 15 different sizes, starting at 1 inch all the way up to 8 inches. So it makes it for a total of 150 frames. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this information was helpful to you. Please stay in touch with our Facebook page is Creative Appliques. We have a Facebook group. It's the Creative Appliques VIP. You can also find me on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel with Creative Appliques. You can find us on Pinterest as Creative Appliques and also on Instagram as Creative Appliques. So please find us and follow us and stay in touch. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again.